Elias Tanner crouched low behind the jagged rock formation, his breath steady despite the rising tension in the air. The Zephyrians were coming. They always came in force, expecting their advanced tech to turn the tide of every battle. But Elias wasn't worried about their plasma rifles or their sleek battle suits. He was worried about something much more dangerous: their arrogance. "They're getting closer," whispered a young resistance fighter beside him, his voice tinged with fear. "What are we supposed to do? We're outgunned." Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the distant tree line where the Zephyrians were steadily marching forward, their weapons raised and ready. He could almost feel the weight of their overconfidence in the air, thick as a fog. The young soldier was right. They were outgunned, sure. But they weren't outmatched. "Remember what I told you," Elias said, his voice low yet sharp, cutting through the nervous chatter. "This isn't a fight of guns, it's a fight of wits. They think we're outdated, weak. They think this old thing." He patted the M1 Garand slung over his shoulder. "Can't even dent their shiny suits. But that's where they're wrong." The young soldier, still clutching his rifle with shaky hands, glanced at the Garand. "You really think this relic can stand up to their tech?" Elias smiled, though it was more of a grim, knowing twist of his lips. "It's not the weapon, kid. It's the hand that holds it." He lifted his eyes to the horizon. "Now listen. I need you to get to that ridge over there. If I give the signal, you take out their long-range comms. We can't let them call for reinforcements." The soldier nodded, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. He wasn't used to this kind of warfare, this improvisational guerrilla combat. Elias, however, had seen enough battles to know the only way to win was to play to the enemy's weaknesses. And their biggest weakness was pride. As the Zephyrian forces advanced, Elias began to issue orders to the rest of the team. He had a plan, simple but effective. The terrain was their ally. They didn't need to face the Zephyrians head-on. They needed to use the land's natural features to create confusion and disarray. Let the Zephyrians do what they did best: underestimate humanity. The moment Elias gave the signal, the first shots rang out. The Garand's distinctive ping echoed through the valley, sharp and unmistakable. The Zephyrians paused, their heads swiveling toward the noise, their advanced helmets scanning for the source. They couldn't see it yet, but they would soon learn how it would feel to be outwitted by something they thought long obsolete. The first of the Zephyrian soldiers dropped, the clean, practiced rhythm of the Garand's fire cutting through their ranks with a precision they weren't expecting. The soldiers faltered, looking toward their commander for guidance. The leader, a towering figure in a sleek black suit of armor, snarled something in an alien tongue, gesturing for them to move forward. But the humans weren't done yet. Elias's squad, hidden in the rocks and trees, unleashed another volley of fire. The Zephyrians, still clinging to their assumption that the humans' weaponry was irrelevant, pushed forward without hesitation. Elias had played this game before. He knew that their arrogance would be their undoing. He could hear their voices now, their commanders barking orders. But it didn't matter. The young resistance fighter, crouching on the ridge as planned, fired at the Zephyrian long-range communication tower. The delicate hum of a plasma rifle was followed by the loud pop of static, and then silence. The Zephyrians had no way of calling reinforcements. The leader of the Zephyrians shouted an order, but it was too late. The humans had already gained the advantage. Another burst from the Garand dropped one of the Zephyrian elites, sending a ripple of shock through their ranks. They began to hesitate, a rare moment of doubt creeping in as the human forces continued to strike from impossible angles. Elias knew this was the turning point. The Zephyrians were no longer just facing an inferior opponent. They were facing something far worse, something they couldn't predict. That's where humanity always excelled, in the unexpected. But then, the Zephyrians regrouped. They weren't fools, and they knew how to fight. The leader called out to his men, and they reorganized, bringing their superior firepower to bear in a concentrated push toward Elias's position. "We've got to fall back," one of the soldiers shouted. "They're too many." Elias didn't answer. He wasn't ready to fall back, not yet. He wasn't even worried. The Garand's ping had reverberated in the valley, its sharp sound a reminder to the Zephyrians of how overconfident they had been. "Stick to the plan," Elias ordered, his voice a calm contrast to the tension around him. "Hold your ground." The battle raged on as the Zephyrians pushed forward, using their technology to cover the advance. They had drones and plasma rifles, but they lacked the intuition of humans. They relied too heavily on their gadgets, and the terrain worked against them. Their shields, which could block energy blasts, were useless when they were forced into tight corners and overhanging cliffs. The Garands found their mark, again and again. One Zephyrian soldier, a young, arrogant officer, stumbled into view, barely able to register what was happening before Elias's Garand took him down with a precise shot. The leader of the Zephyrians growled in frustration, his patience wearing thin as he gave his troops another command. They were losing, but they didn't know it yet. Elias stood tall, his heart steady, despite the chaos. He had led these men through countless firefights, but this one was different. The Garand was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how much technology the Zephyrians had, it was the human spirit that had always triumphed in the end. As the Zephyrians advanced, their formations began to fragment. The humans weren't in front of them anymore. They were everywhere, hidden among the rocks, the trees, the shadows. The Garand's ping rang out in rhythm with Elias's heartbeat. The young soldier on the ridge signaled. Reinforcements were too far off. The Zephyrians were on their own now, facing down a force they couldn't comprehend. Elias's men pushed forward, and the fight became a slaughter. The Zephyrians, who had once laughed at the M1 Garand, now realized too late that there was no stopping it, not when it was wielded by the last people who would never back down. And in the distance, the last echo of the Garand's ping was all that remained. The Zephyrian soldiers advanced, their metallic armor gleaming under the harsh sun. Their footsteps were synchronized, mechanical, unfaltering, like the march of an unstoppable force. Elias Tanner crouched low behind the rocks, watching their approach with calculating eyes. His M1 Garand rested in his hands, the cold steel a reminder of Earth's past. The weapon was old, yes, but its history was engraved in every inch of its surface. The first shot from this rifle had struck deep into enemy hearts during the Second World War. Now it would strike again. "There are too many, Elias," a voice whispered behind him, a young soldier named Lewis. He was shaking, his hand gripping his own rifle like a lifeline. "They'll wipe us out before we can even get a shot off." Elias didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained locked on the advancing Zephyrians. He could feel the weight of their overconfidence in the air, thick as a cloud. They were used to winning, to crushing anything that stood in their way with their superior technology. They couldn't fathom the kind of fight they were about to get. They had underestimated humans before. That was their mistake. "We're not here to win a fair fight," Elias finally said, his voice low but firm. "We're here to survive. And we do that by making them think they're invincible." Lewis frowned, not understanding. "Trust me," Elias continued. "The M1 Garand, this old relic, it's not just about firepower. It's about shaking their confidence. It's about giving them something they never saw coming. Now you ready to show them what humans can do with something they think is useless?" The young soldier nodded, still unsure, but the resolve in Elias's words made him steel himself. The plan had been set into motion. It had to work. There was no other choice. "On my mark," Elias whispered. The first shot rang out, sharp and unmistakable, its distinctive ping echoing across the valley. The Zephyrians froze, their heads snapping toward the sound, their advanced helmets scanning for the source. They couldn't see it yet, but they felt it, an invisible challenge, like a smack across the face. Another shot, and another, each one punctuated by that sharp ping. The Zephyrians began to react, moving with calculated precision, but their movements were frantic, their confidence cracking. Elias had been waiting for this moment. He knew their response would be the same. They were invincible, or so they thought. No one had ever dared to stand against them with something as primitive as a rifle. They had laughed at the Garand. The same way they laughed at humanity's old weapons. But now they weren't laughing. The second wave of shots came in quick succession, a symphony of precision and skill. Elias kept firing, his finger pulling the trigger with methodical rhythm, the Garand's mechanics purring like an old engine, unwavering. Each shot found its mark, picking off the Zephyrian soldiers one by one, and Elias could hear their murmurs of confusion. The plasma rifles that had once made their opponents cower were now rendered useless. They were no longer the predators, they were the prey. "Keep it steady," Elias muttered, keeping his head low as he reloaded. "Let them get close. We need them to think we're retreating. Only then will they make their mistake." Lewis, crouching next to him, was watching the chaos unfold. His eyes were wide, and the disbelief was palpable. They're actually pulling back. How are we doing this?" Elias didn't answer right away. He couldn't afford to get cocky. He knew how quickly things could turn around if they lost focus. "We're showing them that the tech doesn't matter. It's the human touch, the human instinct. The ability to adapt." More shots rang out, the Garand's ping now almost rhythmic, each one hitting its target with deadly accuracy. The Zephyrians hesitated for the first time, their once imposing formation breaking apart. They weren't sure what was happening. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed that technology could solve everything, that advanced weapons and armor could win every fight. But they hadn't counted on a human mind, a human warrior, with the experience to outthink them. Elias stood and fired again, his aim perfect. Another Zephyrian soldier dropped, this time a leader. The troops around him paused, confusion creeping into their ranks. The squad leader, a towering figure with an energy rifle that could burn a human to cinders, took a step forward, looking for the source of the attack. His helmet's system scanned the area, but it couldn't find Elias. The humans were ghosts in the rocks, unseen but deadly. They kept pushing forward, though. They had to. It was their nature to crush, to conquer. But Elias could see it in their movements. The fear had started to creep in. The doubt. "They're losing their edge," Elias muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They don't know how to fight without their toys." "Elias," Lewis said, his voice tight with fear. "They're regrouping. They'll come in stronger now. We won't have another chance." Elias didn't respond right away. He watched as the Zephyrians formed a tighter circle, their energy shields flickering to life, glowing faintly against the dark sky. It was the moment of truth. He had one last gambit. "No," he whispered. The signal was simple, silent. Elias fired a final shot from the Garand, letting the ping ring out again. The noise was a beacon. At that moment, the rest of the human resistance moved. They weren't scattered now. They were focused, concentrated. They'd been waiting for this exact moment. The ambush unfolded in waves. The remaining resistance fighters, hidden in the shadows, opened fire. The Zephyrians, still reeling from the unpredictability of the fight, didn't have the coordination to fend off the attack. They were confused. Disoriented. A few of them fired blindly into the rocks, but it wasn't enough. It couldn't be. Their technology was fast, but it couldn't keep up with the humans' ability to adapt to the chaos of battle. Lewis fired, his rifle shaking as his hands struggled to maintain control, but his aim was true. A Zephyrian soldier fell. Then another. Elias saw it now, saw the fear in their eyes. They were no longer the unstoppable force. They were the prey. The tide had shifted. "Move in," Elias called to the rest of the fighters. "We push them back now. Don't let up." The resistance surged forward, closing the distance. The Garand's ping still echoed in the background, a reminder that this fight had only just begun, and the Zephyrians were losing. Elias moved with purpose, his steps confident despite the odds. The Zephyrians were no longer a threat. Their shields, their technology, they were all worthless now. All it took was the sharp, relentless precision of a few humans who weren't afraid to fight with what they had. And as the last of the Zephyrians turned to flee, Elias stood tall, the Garand slung over his shoulder. The battle wasn't just won by firepower. It was won by the indomitable human spirit. And that, Elias knew, was something no enemy, no matter how advanced, could ever defeat. The enemy was relentless. The ground beneath Elias Tanner's boots trembled as the Zephyrian forces advanced, their energy shields humming with anticipation. Elias tightened his grip on the M1 Garand, the weight of the weapon familiar and steady in his hands. The Garand had been with him through wars long forgotten by the galaxy, but it felt like his only ally now. The Zephyrians, confident in their invincibility, didn't know what they were up against. They thought the old weapon was just a relic, a useless thing. They were wrong. Elias's team had taken cover behind the rocky outcrop, crouching low, silent but vigilant. He could feel the tension rising, a collective breath held by everyone, every soldier wondering if they were about to be wiped out or if they could, somehow, survive. "They're almost here," said Lewis, his voice tight with anxiety. "We can't keep this up. We're running out of ammo." Elias didn't flinch. "We don't need a lot of ammo. We need precision." He glanced at the young soldier, his face pale, eyes wide. "Stay sharp, kid." The Zephyrians had reached the valley, their sleek black armor making them look like a wave of darkness. Their advanced energy rifles and plasma weaponry shone with the confidence of a superior force, but their arrogance would be their downfall. Elias moved his hand to his side, the familiar grip of the Garand's stock reassuring him. He lifted it, peering through the sights. His pulse quickened as the first Zephyrian appeared in his scope. Without hesitation, Elias squeezed the trigger. The sharp ping of the Garand's action rang out, its report echoing through the rocks, and the Zephyrian soldier dropped without a sound. The sound of that ping shattered the stillness, and the Zephyrians froze. They had heard it before, no doubt, but now they were experiencing it for themselves. The first hint of uncertainty flashed through their ranks. They had never fought humans with nothing but this archaic weapon, certainly not with the kind of precision that Elias and his men had shown. But they regrouped quickly, maintaining their calm despite the growing doubt. Elias could hear the Zephyrian commander bark orders through their communication channels, his voice cutting through the tension. He knew the Zephyrians would adapt. They had no choice but to. But Elias wasn't finished yet. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a clean victory. "Give them another one," Elias muttered under his breath, and another soldier, hidden just out of sight, fired from his position. The second shot hit its mark, sending another Zephyrian crashing to the ground. The confusion was palpable now. The Zephyrians were no longer advancing in tight, perfect formation. They were hesitating, searching for cover, looking for the humans they couldn't see. "They're breaking up," Lewis whispered, his tone full of disbelief. "They can't figure out where we are." Elias gave a slight nod. "Exactly. They're used to control. They're used to being the ones who decide the outcome of a fight. But that's not how it works here." The next few minutes felt like hours. The Garand's report echoed across the valley, each shot finding its mark. The Zephyrians were scrambling, their tactics falling apart. They couldn't fight what they didn't understand. Elias knew the M1 Garand was never about sheer firepower. It was about doing what no enemy expected, about breaking their rhythm, shaking their confidence. Then came the breakthrough. The Zephyrian commander, the one who had led the assault with a smugness only a superior force could afford, stepped forward. He raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the area, looking for the source of the fire. He was too far out in the open. Elias's hand tightened on the Garand. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He adjusted his aim, steadied his breath, and squeezed the trigger. The ping echoed once again, and the commander fell, his body jerking violently before collapsing into the dirt. The entire Zephyrian unit stopped, dead in its tracks. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elias's men shifted, but they kept their heads down. There was no time to celebrate. The Zephyrians were shaken, but they weren't defeated yet. They would regroup, reform their strategy. Elias had to make sure they wouldn't get the chance. "No," Elias ordered, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. "We hit them while they're rattled." The resistance fighters moved out of cover, their rifles raised. The Zephyrians had begun to retreat, slowly at first, but Elias could see the crack in their confidence. They hadn't expected humans to stand up to them, let alone to use a weapon as archaic as the M1 Garand with such deadly accuracy. They thought it was a joke, a symbol of a weaker time. But that ping had sounded like a verdict, that arrogance had no place in this fight. One by one, the Zephyrians fell. Some tried to raise their rifles, but they were disoriented. Their shields were too slow to react to the quick, precise strikes from the humans. The terrain had become their enemy. The Zephyrians, used to dominating open fields, struggled in the jagged rocks and narrow ravines. The Garand's semi-automatic fire was relentless, and Elias's team was relentless in turn. "We're almost there," Lewis said, the tension lifting from his voice as the resistance fighters pushed forward. The Zephyrians were falling back now, retreating into the distance. But Elias knew better than to assume victory was certain. The Zephyrians still had their elites, their finest soldiers, and if they regrouped, they would be formidable. Elias couldn't afford to let them get away. This was their only shot. He signaled for his team to fall back. They had to act fast. If they could corner the Zephyrians in the narrow gorge ahead, they could end it. The Garand's ping was a rallying cry, a sound that would haunt their enemies long after the fight was over. The last few Zephyrian soldiers began to retreat in earnest, their formation breaking apart, their shields flickering and weakening under the relentless barrage of fire. Elias and his team moved swiftly, picking off stragglers, driving the remaining soldiers toward the choke point. They wouldn't escape. As the last of the Zephyrians fled into the gorge, Elias looked over at his team. Their faces were set with determination, but there was no triumph in their eyes, not yet. "They'll try to regroup," Elias said, his voice low and firm. "But we've got them now. Stay sharp." With one final push, the resistance cornered the Zephyrians in the gorge. The elite soldiers tried to fight back, but it was too late. The Garand had already delivered its judgment. The ping of the Garand had already sealed their fate. When the battle was over, when the dust settled, Elias stood tall. The Garand rested at his side, the weapon that had defied the expectations of an entire empire. The Zephyrians had come to conquer. They had come with their superior technology, their energy shields, and their plasma rifles. But in the end, it had been a relic from Earth's past that had turned the tide. They had underestimated humanity, and in doing so, they had made their biggest mistake. "We won," Lewis said quietly, almost in disbelief. Elias nodded, his face grim. "For now. But the fight's far from over." The sound of the retreating Zephyrian forces echoed through the narrow gorge, a faint, desperate hum of failing technology. Elias Tanner felt the weight of the moment, but didn't allow himself to savor it, not yet. His team had been through hell, and they were tired, their limbs heavy with exhaustion. The battle was far from over, and Elias knew that their next move could make the difference between survival and annihilation. "We've got them on the run," said Lewis, his voice sounding hollow. He peered into the distance where the Zephyrian soldiers were slowly regathering their strength. "But they'll be back with everything they've got. They won't make the same mistake again." Elias didn't respond immediately. He watched the Zephyrians as they regrouped in the distance, a tight, organized formation forming around their leader. They weren't running, they were pulling back to recalibrate, to mount a counterattack. They would adapt. They always did. "That's exactly what I want them to do," Elias said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Let them think they're regrouping. We'll use it to our advantage." Lewis glanced at him, confusion clear on his face. "What do you mean?" "Let them think they're still in control," Elias replied. "We'll bait them. Make them think we're retreating. We'll strike when they're unprepared." Lewis hesitated. "Is that even possible? After everything they've thrown at us, you think we can still?" Elias's eyes hardened. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, they'll crush us." The young soldier fell silent, swallowing his doubt. Elias could see the hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty of a soldier who had never been tested like this before. But there was no time to nurture fear. The next few minutes would decide everything. Elias moved quickly, issuing orders to his squad. He knew the Zephyrians would be expecting a clear fight, one that they could win with their superior weapons and technology. They had underestimated the resistance before. They wouldn't make that mistake again, but that wouldn't stop Elias from making them pay for their arrogance. "We move fast," Elias said, his voice decisive. "We're going to give them what they expect, then turn it around on them. No mistakes." His team quickly scattered, each member taking their positions. Elias stayed behind, watching the enemy, waiting for their inevitable next move. He had no doubt the Zephyrians would try to press their advantage, but they would be walking right into his trap. The sound of their energy shields flared to life as they moved forward, and Elias knew it was time. The Zephyrians were not cautious. They believed that their superior tech would win the day. They were wrong. The first part of the plan unfolded flawlessly. Elias ordered his team to fire a few sporadic shots from their positions, just enough to make the Zephyrians believe the humans were retreating in fear. The Zephyrians moved forward with their shields raised, their advanced weapons at the ready. But they were being drawn into the perfect kill zone. "On my mark," Elias whispered into the comms, his eyes narrowing. He was already tracking the movements of their leader, the one who had laughed at the human resistance, the one who had dismissed the Garand as a toy. Elias had been waiting for this moment for hours. The Zephyrians thought they were hunting, but in reality, they were being hunted. The moment came. Elias hit the detonator. Explosions erupted in the gorge, powerful charges set strategically to block the Zephyrians' path. Rocks tumbled down, cutting off their retreat and forcing them to move into the narrowest part of the gorge. They had nowhere to go. The Zephyrians were trapped, their tech useless in the chaos of the rock slide and narrow cliffs. Elias and his team descended from the heights, emerging from the shadows. The Garand's ping sounded like a bell tolling the death knell for the Zephyrians. The first soldier fell, then another. The humans were on them now, relentless, efficient, and deadly. The Garand's semi-automatic fire tore through the advancing soldiers as Elias's team moved with precision, taking out the stragglers and closing in on the remaining Zephyrian troops. "They're not going to last long," Lewis said, his voice tight with excitement. "We've got them cornered." Elias nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He watched as the Zephyrians scrambled, their formations crumbling. They had expected a fight, but this was no longer about technology or firepower, it was about will. The human will to survive, to fight back even when the odds were impossible. But just as Elias thought they had broken the Zephyrians' resolve, their leader made a bold move. A massive figure in black armor stepped forward, drawing his energy rifle with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The Zephyrian commander was an imposing sight, towering above his men, his eyes burning with fury. He wasn't going to let this humiliation stand. "You think your tricks will save you?" The Zephyrian leader's voice crackled through the comms, a sneer in his tone. "You're just delaying the inevitable. We will destroy you all." Elias didn't flinch. He'd heard this kind of speech before. The arrogance was always the same, no matter how advanced the enemy's weapons. They never understood the true power of human resilience. The commander took aim, his plasma rifle charging with deadly energy. Elias was ready. He knew the Zephyrian would fire first. And that's exactly what he wanted. The shot rang out, the energy blast streaking toward Elias's position, but he was already moving. With the precision of a practiced soldier, Elias ducked behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding the blast. The Zephyrians were focused on him now, all attention trained on his location. Elias fired once, twice, the Garand's steady rhythm punctuating the air. The shots rang true. The Zephyrian commander stumbled, the first bullet hitting his shield and the second finding its mark. The leader staggered back, his once imposing form now faltering. The confidence that had carried him forward shattered like glass. The Zephyrians had underestimated humanity once again. They thought their weapons could crush the resistance. They thought they could win by force alone. But they hadn't reckoned with the human spirit, the unrelenting will to fight back when pushed too far. The battle continued to rage, but the Zephyrians were broken. Elias's squad had them on the ropes. One by one, their elite soldiers fell. The energy rifles, the plasma weapons, They were no match for the tactics and determination of the humans. And then, with a final push, the Zephyrians retreated. The leader, still reeling from his injury, barked orders to his remaining soldiers, but it was too late. They fled defeated, their once proud forces in disarray. Elias watched them retreat, his heart still pounding in his chest. It was over, for now. The Zephyrians had learned a hard lesson, that human determination could not be extinguished, not by technology, not by power. As his team gathered around him, Elias felt the weight of the moment finally settle. They had won. They had done the impossible. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The Zephyrians would regroup, and they would come again. And when they did, Elias would be ready. "Good work, everyone," he said, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning."